"You black scum don't deserve a burial with honor," Lieutenant Wade Hollister snarled as he aimed his gun at the uniformed man in the middle of the funeral. Before he could pull the trigger, he was taken down by a Secret Service agent embedded in the crowd. The man he dared to target was none other than General Marcus Ellison, a living legend who once led the largest hostage rescue mission of the century. If this happened in the cemetery of your hometown, would you have the courage to step in front of that barrel? Elias Grant stood beside the headstone, unmoving, unreadable, untouched by the whispers curling through the cemetery like smoke. The wind didn't dare touch him. Neither did the rows of uniformed mourners, frozen yards away, watching. The slab of stone beside him was raw white granite, edges sharp, freshly set into the earth. The name engraved read, Lieutenant Commander Ariel H. Mason. The letters gleamed, new, final. She was a decorated officer, the kind whose silence meant more than another man's declaration, and now she was dead. Grant hadn't said a word. He didn't need to. His presence carved silence into the air like a blade. The honor guard stood in formation, rigid, holding their rifles to their chests like relics. No one stepped closer. A few civilians clutched flags, folded tightly in their hands, but even they dared not cross the invisible boundary between them and the man who seemed to root the ground around him into stone. The sun broke through the clouds, thin and merciless, casting hard shadows that cut across the polished metal of the ceremonial rifles, the marble crossstones, and the taut lines of Grant's jaw. Then, quietly, with no protocol, Roy Maddox arrived. He shouldn't have been on shift. His name was never on the schedule for the funeral watch, but sometime around 0700, a sudden request had come through the precinct's system. Officer Maddox was trading shifts. No one questioned it. No one looked twice. The funeral of a fallen female officer didn't register as a flashpoint. The command chain thought nothing of it, but Maddox knew. And Grant knew. Only one of them had made peace with what was about to happen. Maddox moved along the far side of the lawn, his uniform pristine, expression tense. His eyes flicked to Grant, narrowing, jaw clenched. He walked like a man dragging ghosts behind him, tight, deliberate, calculating. No one noticed. No one stopped him. A few officers exchanged glances, but the moment passed like smoke through fingers. It was a funeral. There was silence, there was protocol, there was grief, until there wasn't. Elias Grant stepped forward. His boots sank half an inch into the grass. He moved with the weight of command, silent, grave. The casket lay ahead, draped in the flag, folded star-side up, corners sharp as razors. He didn't reach for it immediately. He just stood over it, head slightly bowed, the wind suddenly still. Then he placed one hand on the casket. His fingers were bare. The skin is pale. No glove, no ritual. Just 5 fingers against the fabric-draped wood, pressing, not in grief, but in resolve. The contact was final, deliberate like the cocking of a gun. That's when Roy Maddox moved. The shout shattered the silence like glass. "Who the fuck are you? Hands up, now." His voice sliced through the honor line, through the officers, through the rows of mourners, through the cemetery itself. The words weren't just volume, they were violence. The kind that stinks of fear, of desperation, of rot, left too long in the walls. His right hand was already moving, jacket shifting, fingers closing on the holster snap. Grant didn't flinch. He didn't turn. His back remained to Maddox. His hand stayed on the casket. The other curled slowly into a fist by his side, tight, measured, unfazed. The tendons in his wrist locked. His posture didn't shift. No glance over the shoulder, no sudden breath, just the simple, surgical tension of a man absorbing a threat he had anticipated long before anyone else smelled it coming. "I said, don't move," Maddox screamed. The gun was out now, raised, pointed, shaking not from fear, but rage, heat, panic. The sound of the holster strap hitting the ground was as loud as the shout itself. Maddox took a step forward, eyes bloodshot, fingers stiff on the trigger. His voice cracked, not with nerves, but with something far uglier. He wasn't asking questions. He wasn't assessing risk. He was reacting to memory, to resentment, to something no court transcript would ever cleanly capture. Then, another man moved. One of the younger soldiers in the line, mid-20s, buzz cut, too clean, instinctively reached for his own sidearm. Training, reflex, protection. He didn't get far. Grant turned his head a fraction. Not a full turn, not a dramatic pivot, just a tilt, left shoulder to left jaw, a subtle shift, the kind of motion you only see if you're watching for it. His eyes didn't even reach the young soldier, but the message landed like a brick. Number. The soldier froze. No command was spoken, no rank was invoked, no gesture made beyond the simplest suggestion of disapproval, and yet it halted every hand, every nerve, every reaction around them. Silence spread again, like black ink in water. Roy Maddox's arm was still extended. The gun trembled, barely, but he didn't fire. The distance between them felt like a war zone, not in miles, in memory, in meaning. Grant still hadn't turned. He stood with his back to death, to violence, to accusation, and didn't blink. Maddox's shout came again, higher now, cracking under its weight. I said, "Stand down." Grant's fist remained clenched, his stance unchanged, the casket under his palm unmoved. But there was something in the angle of his shoulders now harder, heavier. He didn't need to respond. He already had. The silence itself had become a weapon. The line of soldiers behind Maddox began to shift, not with intent, but unease. Eyes darted. One of the funeral coordinators glanced toward the tower to confirm whether cameras were recording. They were. Every frame, every breath. Roy Maddox stood alone with his gun raised, while the rest of the funeral waited for a man to either pull the trigger or realize he no longer held the authority to do so. Time didn't stretch, it cracked. The sun moved just slightly, catching the edge of Grant's shoulder. The wind returned, harder now, pushing at Maddox's back like a shove from fate. Grant's head dipped once, not a bow, not surrender, just the end of a sentence that no one had spoken. The funeral flag on the casket fluttered once. Maddox blinked. His hands didn't lower, but they didn't rise further either. From somewhere down the cemetery, a crow called once, short, sharp. No one moved. Not one voice, not one step, not one click of safety being engaged. The threat stood still, and the man who never turned back made everyone else question why they ever looked away. The silence didn't break, it shattered. The wind that once held its breath now spun, fierce and uninvited, through the folded flags and brass insignias like it knew something had gone wrong. Not just wrong, contaminated. Roy Maddox's shout still hung in the air like a flare left burning too long, toxic and accusatory, refusing to dissolve. "I was following orders," he screamed again, his voice cracked, spit flying. "I took a command, I didn't act on my own." His words weren't a defense. They were a flare sent skyward searching for someone, anyone, who might claim ownership of what he'd just done. But no answer came. Not from the row of uniformed superiors frozen stiff. Not from the officers who now refused to meet his gaze. Not from the silent brass who had once lobbied for his promotions. Maddox's voice spiraled higher, desperate. "I was told to intervene. You think I just did this? You think I made this call myself?" His face was red, veins pulsing at his neck, eyes bulging not from guilt, but betrayal. He was alone, and that was not the plan. Grant didn't move. The man still stood facing the casket, hand resting on the flag, as if the commotion behind him were no more than wind in distant trees. He didn't breathe heavier. He didn't blink faster. But the silence around him thickened. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was the weight of it. His profile cast long under the slanting sun, carved like a statue too stubborn to be broken by noise. Then, slowly, he spoke. Just once, just enough. "Be careful," he said, voice low, firm, perfectly modulated, a tone that could cut through steel. "Don't let him define himself." It was a sentence, but it felt like an execution. Maddox staggered back a step as if the words had shoved him. Something in him flickered panic, recognition, maybe both. He spun toward the funeral director, the honor guard, the rows of witnesses, each face turned not to the man holding the gun but the one who had never once acknowledged it. "You all saw it." Maddox shouted, scrambling. "You all know what this is. I'm not the one you should be looking at." But now, they were looking, and it wasn't at Grant, it was at him. Because something had shifted in the gravity of the moment. His gun was still drawn, his voice was still loud, but his authority had collapsed. The chain of command no longer looped around his badge. It dangled, broken, rusted, visible. Then the music started. A trumpet, low, solemn, slow. The funeral bugler had begun his call, soft, metallic, reverent. It was the sound of honor being paid, and simultaneously, the sound of something sacred being ripped in half. As the first note hit the air, one of the officers broke rank and stepped forward, not quickly, not violently, just enough. His hand reached for Maddox's wrist. The gesture wasn't aggressive, it was administrative, final. "Put it down, officer." The command was calm. Maddox didn't obey. Instead, he shrieked, "You don't get it. He's the one you should fear. He's dangerous. He's not even military anymore." Another officer approached, then another. Maddox twisted, his body turning with erratic spasms, the barrel of his gun never quite steady. The bugle played on unflinching, unbroken as the symbol of military sanctity battled the image of a man unraveling. Then, under the folding chairs near the honor guard click, someone noticed it, a soft metallic sound. The recording had begun to play. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but it came from beneath the folding chair closest to Grant's positions, just beneath where his right foot had been planted when he laid his hand on the casket. A tiny black dot, now blinking, transmitting. A voice recorded earlier began to speak, calm, analytical. If he shows up today, he'll act, not because of the circumstances, but because he's been waiting for this kind of moment. He needs the theater. He needs a stage to justify what he already wants to do. It wasn't Grant's voice, but it was about Roy Maddox. Maddox heard it and froze. The gun in his hand dipped slightly. "What the hell is that?" he spat. A young officer stepped forward, pulled the small transmitter from beneath the chair. The insignia on the back read DI, 3rd Division, Departmental Intelligence. This wasn't surveillance. It was foresight. Someone somewhere had predicted this and set the bait. The tape continued. "You won't need to provoke him. He'll provoke himself. Just be still and let his script eat him alive." Roy flinched. "That's a setup," he barked. "You think I don't see what this is? You're planting evidence, trying to frame me." But no one spoke. No one answered. Instead, the honor guard advanced. 2 men moved in sync. One unlatched the holster, still flapping against Maddox's leg. The other gripped the gun barrel, gently, and pulled it downward. It was a clean motion, surgical, performed 100 times in training, but rarely with such brutal simplicity in the field. The gun came loose. Maddox fought it barely. But the strength wasn't there, not against trained hands, not against the pressure of silence bearing down on him like judgment. The bugle continued. Maddox stumbled as the weight of resistance left his hands. "You're all blind," he shouted, voice fraying into pieces. "You're falling for it. This is his game. This is what he wants." The gun was gone. The cuffs clicked. The sound echoed through the courtyard like the crack of a ceremonial rifle. 2 more officers seized his arms. The funeral continued. The flag remained in place. Grant had not turned. As they began to drag Maddox away, boots scraping against stone and earth, his voice hit one last octave of fury. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he screamed at Grant's back, foaming with disbelief. "You don't even turn around when a gun's pointed at you? You think you're some kind of god? Who are you that you don't even have to face me?" Grant did not respond, did not look, did not acknowledge. The sun, for a brief second, passed behind a slow-moving cloud. The light dimmed. The trees around the cemetery stood like stone, not even rustling. And, in the distance, the final note of the bugle sounded long, flat, eternal. They rewound the footage exactly 12 times before anyone dared say a word. The drone feed, stable and surgical, hovered above the funeral grounds like a silent god. No tremor, no blur, just the high-definition truth, unforgiving and without narrative. 11 seconds. That was all. 11 seconds of a man pointing a gun at a casket, at silence, at a figure who didn't flinch, while the entire United States military stood watching. They timed it frame by frame. Roy Maddox had drawn his weapon, shouted, and advanced not 1 but 2 full steps toward General Elias Grant before the weapon was finally taken from him. 2 steps. No hesitation, no flinch, no error in judgment, just movement, purposeful, predatory. The footage had no commentary. It didn't need any. There was no voiceover, no dramatic soundbed, just the ambient noise of the ceremony, the whistle of wind over marble, the distant echo of the bugle's final call, and the hiss of static as the camera's autofocus adjusted mid-zoom. Then the click of the holster opening, the twitch of the right hand, The shout, the escalation. 11 seconds. Maddox didn't stutter. He didn't blink. He didn't stall. He knew exactly who he was pointing at, and he knew exactly what it meant. The broadcast networks ran the footage by nightfall. Every major station, every local affiliate, every commentary desk that once tap danced around law enforcement misconduct now faced something too raw to spin. The words came slowly at first, then broke into a flood: violation, abuse of authority, racial targeting. But the first viral comment that exploded across social platforms wasn't a legal term. It was 5 words. This is a declaration of war. They weren't exaggerating, because in that feed, cold, clean, irreversible, the country saw more than just a gun raised. They saw intent. They saw a man aim at history and try to erase it. And they saw another man Elias Grant refuse to be erased. The zoom-in was brutal. Mid-frame, Maddox's face twisted, eyes narrow, lips curled into something too bitter to be called resolve. Rage? Yes, but deeper. The kind of hatred that ages in the dark, that grows teeth behind closed doors, that waits for a sanctioned moment to finally erupt into daylight. His target was unmoving. Grant's shoulders were back, his chin unbowed. The camera caught the angle perfectly. Maddox's gun pointed directly at the space between Grant's shoulder blades. No mistake, no confusion, no room for accidental misfire or split-second decision. The lens saw everything. America saw everything. And the justice system, for once, had nothing left to blur. The 10th second was the worst, because in that 10th second, just before the gun was stripped from Maddox's hand, the drone camera caught something else subtle, chilling, absolute. A wink. Grant didn't look at Maddox. He didn't so much as twitch in his direction, but his left eye shifted once and made contact with the man standing 2 rows behind the honor guard, a colonel, hardened, older, watching the chaos unfold like a man studying weather patterns. That wink wasn't playful. It wasn't sarcastic. It was a signal. Don't move. Don't intervene. Let it burn. Let him do exactly what he's here to do. The colonel nodded, almost imperceptibly, and kept his hands by his side. Across the frame, the soldiers remained still. The gun remained raised, and Grant never turned. But the most chilling frame came 3 seconds earlier. At second number 7, the drone zoomed slightly as the wind caught the side of Grant's hand. The light hit just right. On the inside of his palm, faint but deliberate, were a series of digits. Not random, not smudged. It was Roy Maddox's military ID number, burned into memory, written into flesh. The camera caught it, froze it, and the analysts circled it with red markers during their post-briefing. It wasn't just that Grant knew his attacker. It was that he had remembered the man before the attack even happened. The message was clear. I knew you'd come, and I wanted to remember exactly who you were when you did. Not a threat, a ledger. That image alone went viral. A general marked by the ID of the man who would later aim a gun at his spine during a military funeral. The symbolism wasn't just powerful, it was biblical. The press called it preparation. Activists called it prophecy. The Pentagon called it uncommented intelligence. Grant didn't comment at all. He didn't need to. Maddox, of course, had no idea about the ID. Not at the moment. Not during the brief silence after. Not even when he was tackled and cuffed. It wasn't until the clip began circling the nation that his lawyers scrambled. They tried to pivot. Claimed emotional instability. Claimed heat of the moment. Claimed confusion, fatigue, and overreaction. But the footage said otherwise. It didn't blink. It didn't stutter. It recorded a man who walked forward with violent intent, stood still long enough to decide, then had his weapon removed only because someone else acted. Not because he surrendered, not because he hesitated. He didn't hesitate at all. 11 seconds. It was enough time to call a warning. Enough time to lower a weapon. Enough time to recognize the back of a superior officer at a funeral and choose a different path. But Roy Maddox hadn't chosen anything. He'd already decided. In those 11 seconds, what was revealed wasn't confusion, it was character. He didn't react. Executed. The high-resolution footage closed in one final time, before ending the last frame a close-up of Maddox's eyes. The rage in them was unmistakable. There was no flicker of realization, no panic, no remorse, just fury, and not to himself, at being stopped. You could see it in the twitch at the corner of his mouth, the hard line of his jaw, the pupils locked like targeting reticles on the only man he hated enough to risk everything for. And in that frozen moment, America saw something terrifyingly familiar. A man who hated not because of what was done to him, but because of what he couldn't do to someone else. They paused that image on every screen in the country. And still, Grant never turned around. You don't spend 11 seconds pointing a loaded gun at a national hero unless something inside you has been building to do it for years. This wasn't a misfire. This wasn't panic. This wasn't confusion under pressure. What Roy Maddox did wasn't a mistake. It was math. A long, bitter equation written in silence, arrogance, and a burning need to be bigger than he was ever allowed to be. The drone caught the act, yes, but the origin? Those lived elsewhere, in deserts, in shadows, in one unforgiving file after another, that never made it to court, but bled across too many lives to stay buried. They said it started in Kandahar, not in the firefight itself, but in the aftermath. The unit was fractured, pinned down between two collapsing walls of smoke and enemy fire. 3 men were bleeding out. One had already stopped screaming. Maddox had the radio, the wrong frequency, the wrong tone, and a decision to make. Grant didn't hesitate. He'd crossed open ground with zero cover, pulled 2 soldiers back by their armor, shoved a third over his shoulder, and dropped them behind a steel barricade that wasn't even meant to be cover. It held anyway. He held anyway. But Roy? Roy had stayed behind the Humvee, watching, still breathing, still clean. When the bullets stopped and the sand settled, someone whispered, "Where the hell was Maddox?" The answer? He had taken position behind the engine block, claimed the radio wasn't functioning, and said he was awaiting secondary orders. There were no orders left, just blood, just the silence of someone choosing not to move. In the report, Grant didn't mention Roy by name. He didn't have to. The GPS logs spoke louder, the timestamps, the comm data. The ink didn't accuse it condemned. Quietly, legally, efficiently. Within months, Maddox was pulled from active combat. Within weeks, Grant had signed off on a recommendation for full removal from the U.S. military under Article 133 Conduct Unbecoming. It wasn't just about fear or cowardice. It was about intent and identity. Maddox's service record, once buffed and sanitized by friends in the local precincts, couldn't survive real scrutiny. Not under Grant's watch. Not with someone who memorized troop rosters by heart. Not with someone who counted lives the way other men counted medals. But politics got involved. A senator, a donor, a man who had more golf games with generals than combat tours. Suddenly, the removal recommendation disappeared from the official pipeline. Not rejected, just stalled, then diluted, then quietly replaced with honorable separation under non-specific reassignment. On paper, Roy Maddox was out, but not disgraced, and most critically not banned. He was free to apply for civil enforcement positions. His record didn't mention Kandahar. His file didn't show the hesitation, just citations. None earned, all endorsed. Someone opened the door, and Roy walked through like he owned the floor. That's how he ended up in Boston. That's how he landed on a short list for precinct advancement less than 9 months after discharge. That's how he slipped back into uniform different colors, same violence, and that's how the rot kept breathing. But it never left Grant. Because there's something no cover-up can erase. Memory. People remembered. Officers from Kandahar whispered in corners. The one who didn't run saved us. The other one, he hid. We all know. One phrase began to stick. It was short, bitter, accurate. The man who lived under someone else's name. Because Grant's bravery had cast a shadow so long, Roy couldn't help but exist in it. Every time he walked into a ceremony, a bar, or a department function, someone said Grant's name louder than his. Roy wasn't hero adjacent. He was parasite adjacent, and he hated every second of it. There was a video once, a grainy handheld clip from a local military celebration. Nothing official, nothing broadcast. Just a moment, caught by a phone camera. Grant walked in. Maddox was already there, surrounded by a few younger officers, talking loudly, louder than needed, about deployments, tactics, camaraderie. The tone was thin. Bravado is trying too hard to hold air. Grant walked straight past him, didn't break stride. Maddox stepped forward, hand outstretched, smile waiting. The camera caught Grant's eyes. Cold, sharp. He didn't look at Maddox's face. He looked at his shoulder, at the insignia. Just that. Then he turned his head and walked away. No handshake, no words, no performance. Just a stare that said, "You didn't earn that badge." Maddox had laughed it off. "Guys got issues," he said to the group, trying to keep the grin. "Probably mad I got out first." But everyone had seen it. That wasn't dismissal. That was erasure. And Roy never recovered from that moment. Because it wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It was worse. It was a quiet acknowledgement that he didn't belong. Later, someone found notes in Roy's handwriting, scrawled into the corner of an old training manual, slashed deep enough to tear the paper. "He thinks he's above protocol. I'll show him who stands taller." It wasn't rage. It was arithmetic, the kind of hatred you ferment, the kind that waits. And then, 11 seconds. 11 seconds at a funeral where Roy could finally play hero with a weapon instead of a wound. But it wasn't confusion. It wasn't fear. It was history cashing in. It was a man acting not out of impulse, but vengeance, curated by shame. The public didn't know the Kandahar file. Not yet. But Grant did, and he never needed to speak it, because sometimes the loudest truths are spoken by what a man refuses to touch. There was no verdict, no gavel, no sentence, but the grass already knew who had lost. It lay untouched, obedient under a perfect row of boots, blades of green trimmed to military precision, a ceremonial field made to receive dignity. And yet, just beyond the fold of the flag and the silver edge of the casket, one man stood like a fault line, not flanked by guards, not shielded by lawyers, but armed with something far heavier than a weapon: memory. General Elias Grant held a small black pouch in his left hand. Its contents weren't classified, they weren't valuable. They were symbolic in a way that not even the highest court could reverse. Inside was a single item, an old, tarnished badge, bronze, scuffed. Its number is still legible, but faded with time. It had once belonged to Roy Maddox, and it had once meant something. He had earned it not through valor, not through clarity, but by maneuver, by politics, by proximity to power, by the silence of people too tired to argue. That badge had survived disciplinary action. It had survived a transfer out of combat. It had even survived Grant's recommendation to strip it completely, but it had not survived Grant's judgment. When Maddox was removed from the unit, Grant kept the badge, not as evidence, not as leverage, but as proof that shame, once defined, should never again be allowed to wear polish. And now, here it was. The pouch opened slowly, with the kind of precision born from ritual, not performance, not theater. Grant didn't announce what he was doing. He didn't clear his throat. His hand simply reached into the cloth like a man retrieving a bullet that never fired, and when he pulled it free, there was no flourish, only gravity. The bugle began its slow climb again, the first few notes piercing the air like clean light through old glass. It wasn't background music. It was a call, not for Roy Maddox, not for forgiveness, not even for judgment. It was for the dead, and only for them. Grant stepped forward, 1 foot, 2. Then, with his back straight and his eyes unflinching, he placed the badge once issued to a man who had stood for nothing gently on the center of the flag-draped casket. He didn't pin it. He didn't press it. He let it sit there, like truth left bare in daylight. And the music continued. No one dared move. Roy was standing 20 feet away, not restrained, not cuffed. His uniform was still intact, although the authority it once projected had long since curdled into something sour. His face, once hard with defiance, now began to tremble at the corners. His eyes darted to the badge, then to the flag, then to the general who had refused to return his stare, not once, not ever. Then came the sound that did more damage than a sentence ever could. A gasp, soft, human, held in too long. A woman older, still sitting in the third row. Her hair was gray, her posture stiff from grief, not age. She was the mother of Corporal Hennessy, a soldier Roy had humiliated months earlier during an altercation that never made it to public record but scarred through the core like acid through steel. She had never spoken publicly, never gone to the press, never filed a suit. She didn't need to. Now, as the bugle pierced its final notes, she put her hand to her mouth, her shoulders shook, and tears burst from her like wind from a cracked dam. But she made no sound, not a scream, not a word, not even a whimper. because there are some cries that only the dead should hear. Roy turned toward her instinctively, a reaction. Maybe guilt, but he couldn't hold the look. He dropped it fast, and then the pressure collapsed inward. His knees buckled, not from force, not from violence. There were no punches, no tackle, no justice in the form of fists. He simply broke. The weight of what was not said, the silence of a nation watching, the absence of a single person stepping in to defend him slammed into his chest like a tidal collapse. He fell to his knees, not to pray, not to beg, but because gravity had finally reclaimed a lie too bloated to stand. His palms hit the grass, and his eyes hit the earth, and the badge sat unmoved. The drone above, unblinking, caught the moment. Grant didn't turn. He didn't react. His hand had already left the casket. He stood in his dress uniform, head level, eyes forward, the sun behind him, casting no shadow across the dead. Then the light shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. The lens of the drone caught the sunlight as it reflected off the casket's edge, rising in a flare that split across Grant's face in a perfect arc, a crown of fire and silence. For 1 second, the general's profile looked carved from stone and flame, and in that single still frame, the image burned itself into national memory. He wasn't performing, he was becoming. The bugle's final note ended, and still, no one moved. Roy Maddox remained on the grass. His badge remained on the casket, and Elias Grant remained silent. The grass never stained, not once, not even when the weapon was drawn, not even when the air was cut silent with a scream, not even when Roy Maddox collapsed, like a man who had run out of lies to stand on. The earth beneath General Elias Grant remained untouched by blood, but soaked with something heavier, truth too sharp to clot. And somewhere, tucked beneath the back of Grant's collar, hidden beneath medals and stiff-pressed lines, was the proof that it had once come close, a scar, thin, pale, too precise to be from shrapnel. Just below the nape of his neck, it ran like an afterthought carved into muscle memory. The bullet hadn't landed, but it had passed close enough to name him, close enough to write history in skin. No one had talked about the shot. Not then, not in Kandahar, not later, not even in whispers. It hadn't made the report. It didn't need to. Because when a soldier fires near his own and misses only because his hands lack conviction, the silence that follows is more condemning than any tribunal. And Grant had never mentioned it, but he hadn't forgotten. Weeks before the funeral, a message reached the desk of the city's police chief. It was unsigned. No IP, no header trail, just 6 words. He will draw again. Be ready. The chief forwarded it to internal. They flagged it as vague threat analysis, a possible crank tip. But the message wasn't poetic, it was surgical, and too specific to be dismissed as noise. The phrase again stuck in the throat of one analyst. She circled it twice, because again didn't mean random. It meant precedent. It meant history. It meant someone knew this wasn't going to be spontaneous combustion, it was calculated ignition. When the ballistics team ran diagnostics on the Glock Roy Maddox carried to the funeral, the findings didn't make headlines. They were too technical, too nuanced for a headline war, but not too quiet for meaning. The trigger assembly had been modified, not just cleaned, not just tuned, altered. The weight-to-fire ratio had been brought down from factory standard to competition range, a breath away from hair trigger status. They called it lightened for performance. But performance of what? The adjustment wasn't random. It wasn't negligence. Someone had planned for a shot to go off with minimal effort. Whether Roy made the modification himself or had help was still under internal review, but the result was the same: 1 ounce of pressure more, and the funeral would have ended in death, not disgrace. The irony wasn't lost on the senior analyst at DI. She called the modification what it was: a trigger meant for guilt without hesitation. The review boards tore apart Roy's previous range logs. There was a pattern. The man didn't shoot for practice, he shot for rehearsal. Every session, his target prints were human silhouettes, not standard circles, and one silhouette, in particular, had been printed with custom ink. Low contrast, grainy, but still recognizable. It was a blurred image of Grant, scanned, altered, anonymized, but the shape of the shoulders, the arch of the chin, the medals, unmistakable. He had been training not to defend himself. He had been training to execute an icon. Grant, on the other hand, had already documented the threat long before any bullet grazed flesh. A year prior, In a confidential report filed through the Department of Military Ethics, he had written, "He does not represent one man. He is the physical symptom of a country that teaches rage as an identity. He is not dangerous because he hates me. He is dangerous because his hatred has been licensed, armed, and rewarded." It was filed, reviewed, archived, and ignored because no one wants to believe that a decorated cop could be the result of systemic design. It was easier to label him a bad apple later than a ticking time bomb now. But Grant had known. He had known since the day Maddox spat the words in a locker room outside Kandahar, years before ranks changed, before uniforms were different colors. "I'll get back what I lost because of you. It'll only take one moment." The tone wasn't rage, it was certain. He said it like a man rehearsing a victory that hadn't yet happened but already felt deserved. Like the trigger pull was not a risk, but a right. It was never about justice. It was about revenge, rewritten as redemption. Roy hadn't wanted to be cleared. He had wanted to be crowned, and the only way to do that was to prove that Grant, quiet, decorated, untouchable Grant, could bleed, could be outmaneuvered, could be made to flinch. But Grant hadn't flinched. Not when the Glock was drawn, not when the air choked on the sound of metal, not when every other man in uniform tensed. Because Grant didn't fear the gun, he feared the country that allowed Roy Maddox to carry it that far without question. The message had never been about one funeral, one badge, one betrayal. It was about all the other moments where someone like Roy wasn't stopped, where the scar on Grant's neck became a metaphor, near-fatal warnings left to fade under the collars of those too silent to scream. The country had seen 11 seconds, but Grant had lived through 10 years. He didn't need the bullet to land to understand what it had always been aimed at. And still, the grass had no blood, because Grant hadn't given Maddox the satisfaction. He hadn't turned. He hadn't spoken. He had let the system and the silence do what they were too late to do the first time: watch, document, and finally believe him. Even silence leaves echoes, especially when it belongs to a man who never had to raise his voice to be heard, especially when that silence has been carried through fire, through betrayal, through 11 long seconds and 10 long years without cracking, especially when your name is Roy Maddox and the silence you once mocked now sleeps in your bloodstream, wakes in your dreams, and stands quietly behind you in every darkened hallway of your mind. He saw Grant every night now, not in courtrooms, not in the footage that played endlessly across the news cycle, not even in the still frame burned into the public imagination. Grant with his hand on the casket, face half lit, not turning. No, Roy saw him differently. He saw him closer, closer than truth, closer than breath. In his dreams, Grant didn't speak. He didn't accuse. He didn't need to. He stood behind Roy's shoulder, eyes steady, arms at ease, watching, waiting. Every time Roy turned around in the dream, there Grant was, unmoving, unblinking, silent. His presence was heavier than violence, more suffocating than guilt. There was no chase, no confrontation, just the unbearable weight of being observed by someone who didn't need to say he'd won, and Roy couldn't stand it. He started leaving the television on at night, just to drown out the silence. He tried whiskey, then stronger things. Nothing worked. The silence didn't need permission to return. It always found its way in, uninvited and merciless, like a judgment served in shadows. There was no report filed about Roy's mental state, no public statement of instability, but those close to him could see it. His eyes no longer darted, they dragged. His voice no longer barked, it rasped. And most damning of all, his laugh, once sharp, once arrogant, had vanished entirely, because silence had moved in, and it brought company. Somewhere far from where Roy slept, Grant sat alone in a study with walls made of concrete and memory. The windows were narrow. The light inside is cold. On his desk, a leather-bound notebook, worn from time, opened to a page with nothing but one sentence, scrawled in a steady hand: the loud "do not defeat the patient." New title, new date, new attribution. It wasn't a quote. It was a line in the sand. Grant had always understood timing. He knew that patience wasn't inaction. It was restraint sharpened into edge. It was knowing when not to speak, when not to strike, when to let others reveal themselves. And Roy? Roy had always been loud, always rattling, always pushing, until the day came when his volume couldn't hide his aim. And then, it was too late. They had offered Grant political posts before, multiple times, some discreet, some public. join the commission, lead the advisory council, step into policy. Each invitation was dressed in compliments, wrapped in strategy, each one a seat at a table where his silence would be diluted by microphones, his purpose repurposed into talking points. He declined them all, not with condescension, not with bitterness, simply with clarity. "I wasn't put here to manage speeches," he once told a colonel over coffee. "I was put here to hold a door open and keep it from being kicked in." And so he stayed, in the background, at the thresholds, at the symbolic places where things could fall apart if the wrong person got too loud too fast. He wasn't protecting a system. He was protecting the space between people, that fragile, sacred space where violence tries to sneak in dressed as authority. One of his former officers, now a writer, thin with a steel spine, once submitted an essay to a defense journal. It never made the front page, but it cut deeper than headlines. "We served under a man who taught us to win without shooting, who taught us that real strength never demands applause, that silence, when chosen, is the language of command." The article was never quoted by Roy Maddox, but someone printed it out and slid it under Roy's cell door one night. He tore it to pieces, but he read it first. Meanwhile, back in that cold study, Grant penned a short letter, not to the courts, not to the media, but to the funeral planning committee that had asked how he might like to be remembered should the worst come to pass. His response was only 4 lines long. "If I die, do not bow, do not lower the flag, do not mourn the loss of sound. Just stand exactly as you did that day with your back straight, your hands steady, and your silence louder than their noise." No return address, no signature beyond his initials, because Grant never needed a stage. He needed a line that couldn't be crossed. And Roy? Roy had crossed it long before the gun was drawn, long before the drone was recorded, long before the badge hit the casket. His crime wasn't the act, it was the intention that led him there. Now, left alone with his noise, Roy had nothing to cling to but the echo of a man who never once raised his voice and still brought him to his knees. That's the thing about silence. When it's chosen, it becomes armor. When it's earned, it becomes prophecy. When it's embodied as it was in Elias Grant, it becomes a weapon more permanent than any bullet. The silence hadn't just haunted Roy Maddox. It had once saved him. But the truth about salvation is that not everyone sees it as mercy. Some treat it like debt, and Roy had never been the type to carry what he couldn't repay on his terms. Years before the funeral, before the drone, before the badge hit the coffin and Maddox hit the grass, there had been dust, heat, and chaos somewhere far from camera lenses and national memory. A place where names were spoken in code and blood was the currency of leadership. Roy had been pinned down, forgotten, left behind when the convoy pulled out faster than protocol should have allowed. Radio dead, leg torn from shrapnel, one hand is bleeding, one side is deaf. The platoon hadn't realized it until 15 minutes into retreat, and by then, no one was going back, except one. Grant didn't announce it. He didn't call for support. He didn't wait for clearance. He left the armored vehicle, crossed 2 ridgelines, and found Maddox slumped in the shadow of a broken bunker wall, unconscious but breathing. He didn't ask if Roy was worth it. He didn't check if anyone else volunteered. He carried the man over his shoulder, across terrain too hot for logic, too open for luck. 189 yards. Roy never said thank you. He didn't need to. 2 days after the extraction, Grant's inbox pinged with an anonymous email sent from the base terminal. The subject line was blank. The body of the message read, "I don't need handouts from a fucking black savior. You didn't carry me. I survived." It was unsigned, but the syntax, the venom, the particular weight of the insult, it was unmistakable. Grant never responded. He didn't forward it. He didn't print it. He just read it once, then archived it into memory. He didn't need evidence to remember betrayal. But the file wasn't the only thing he kept. Roy had suffered damage to his leg during the rescue. Medics had advised surgery, not immediate but critical. Without it, scar tissue would calcify. His gait would be uneven. His endurance is compromised. The prescription was clear. Months of recovery, focused therapy, and reassessment. Roy declined. He signed release forms, walked out of medical care, and within 6 months, he had applied for transfer into law enforcement. He didn't want healing. He wanted leverage. The application process flagged his military background, not for honors, but for risk markers. An internal memo was passed around HR desks with notes like emotional volatility, non-compliance with psychological recertification, possible racial bias, and finally, the line, recommend against field assignment. But that memo never made it to final review, because somewhere along the chain, a signature appeared from someone with more stars than scruples. Roy was pushed through, given a badge, given a beat, given the illusion that he had built something for himself. But Grant remembered, not the wound, not the insult, but the simple fact that when given the option to rebuild himself into something better, Roy had chosen instead to load himself with more authority, less accountability. That wasn't trauma. That was the trajectory. Years later, investigators would find photographic evidence tucked in a storage locker registered under Roy's name. Inside, a cardboard box of shooting range targets. Most were standard issue. A few were custom prints, grainy headshots blurred through heavy photocopy ink. The jawline is familiar, the posture military, the eyes, Grant's. He had been shooting at ghosts that wore his face, and missing. But the bullet didn't need to land to hit its mark. The point had always been to prepare. To train not for conflict, but for correction. Roy wanted one moment, one chance to rewrite history by erasing the only man who refused to pretend he belonged. The public never saw that locker, but Grant did. He was given the case files before the trial, a courtesy, a warning, a quiet nod that what he'd long suspected had now hardened into fact. Among the folders, taped to a supplemental page, was another form, a copy of an old petition filed years before unsigned, unsubmitted, a plea for leniency. Roy had filed it once, quietly, in the months after the incident in Kandahar, a request for internal review to allow re-entry into the reserve system. The document was never processed, because it never left the hands of the man assigned to review it. Grant, he'd kept it in a sealed envelope, not out of sympathy, but out of principle. He had considered submitting it, had thought once briefly that even a man who spat at his rescue might deserve the chance to prove he wouldn't do it again. But Roy had proved otherwise, so Grant had held the form, and now, years later, that sealed envelope sat open on Grant's desk. The document inside had been stamped once, in thick, black ink. The stamp said only, "Released," but it wasn't filed. It was mailed to the prosecution, because this time, Grant wasn't going to carry Roy anywhere. He wasn't going to carry his silence, his shame, his redemption. He wasn't going to keep any part of him alive that didn't deserve to be. Forgiveness is not weakness, but forgetting, that's surrender. And Grant had never surrendered. He had spent his whole life avoiding silence, and now he was locked inside it. The walls of the holding cell were thick, lined with institutional beige and the stench of past confessions. They didn't echo, they absorbed. Every shout, every plea, every insult hurled at the cameras, at the guards, at the system, all of it vanished in the cushion of steel and stone. And in that space, Roy Maddox finally broke. He didn't break like a man collapsing under violence. He wasn't beaten. He wasn't starved. He wasn't dragged to his knees by anything as cinematic as justice. No, he broke quietly, pathetically, alone, in the middle of a Tuesday. His voice cracked first. "I don't understand." He was speaking to no one, or maybe to the wall, or to the air, or to the idea of Elias Grant, still looming in his mind, never turning, never responding. His fingers curled into fists on his knees, trembling not with rage but with something uglier, confusion. Pure, bottomless, spiraling confusion. "Why won't he say anything?" he muttered again. "Why won't he just say something? Anything?" I pulled the damn gun. I aimed at his spine. I shouted. I demanded. And he trailed off. Then the tears came. Not cinematic, not brave, not masculine in their fury. Just wet, broken, uncontrollable sobs that rolled down the cheeks of a man who had once barked commands through bullhorns, who once laughed behind bulletproof glass, who once trained his aim on a man whose silence now haunted him more than a bullet ever could. Guards watched from behind shatterproof glass. No one said a word, because weakness, when it finally arrives in men like Roy, is not deserving of sympathy. It is only proof that the bluff has ended. Hours later, in a separate building where silence was worn like armor, Grant sat at a desk with a lined notebook and wrote a single sentence. His pen was steady, his posture was unshaken. "They are not afraid of bullets." A pause. Then the second line. They are afraid of eyes that need no defense. He didn't write Roy's name. He never had to, because this was never about an individual. It was about the virus of men who thought power came from projection. That volume meant victory. That authority came from the holster, and not the hand that refused to reach for it. Back in the cell, Roy reached for something too, a phone. One loud call. He didn't waste it. He punched the number with the speed of someone who'd dialed it 1,000 times. The number of the man who helped him, who covered for him, who whispered in back rooms and signed transfer papers he never should have touched. His father-in-law, Senator Edward Lang. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. Voicemail. Again. 6 times in a row. Maddox hit redial. No answer. No callback. Just a machine with a clipped, professional voice, reminding him that power only works when it's politically useful. And Roy Maddox had lost all utility. The man who once carried his sins like medals now couldn't get a 2-second voicemail. Somewhere outside the cell block, a man stood quietly at the edge of the facility gates. He didn't wear a suit, didn't hold a press badge. His boots were scuffed, his back slightly curved from years of field wear. His jacket bore a single patch faded, but still legible. 82nd Airborne. He hadn't come for the spectacle. He hadn't come to spit. He came to be seen. A guard approached. "Sir, can I help you?" The man didn't answer at first. He just looked through the barbed wire past the fence, into the walls where Roy Maddox now sat with bloodshot eyes and a phone that didn't ring back. Then he spoke, low, steady. "I served with both of them." The guard waited. The man's jaw clenched once. "I stayed in the war because of Elias Grant, because I saw what it meant when a man doesn't abandon his post even when leadership breaks down." Maddox, he didn't leave the war. He ran from it, so he could come home and aim a weapon at the only man who carried him out. The guard didn't respond, didn't need to. Truth isn't up for debate when it's dressed in boots and scars. Back inside, Roy slumped lower on the cot. The television mounted in the corner flickered. News coverage, split screen. Left side, Roy Maddox, face shadowed, grainy, captured in booking footage, cold, static, undone. Right side, Elias Grant, caught mid-step, sunlight slicing across his shoulder, his eyes locked forward, the American flag rippling behind him. No words, no narration, no interviews, just imagine against image, and somehow, across the silence, the whole country understood exactly what had been said and who had spoken. Because silence, when earned, is not absence. It is judgment without a courtroom. Roy watched. His lip twitched, not in recognition, but in fear, because for the first time, he understood that Grant had never needed to raise a voice, or a weapon, or a finger. He had already won, not with law, not with the press, but with restraint. And now, the man who once demanded control over every room he entered could not even command the dignity of being looked at. So he cried, for real, for once, and no one came to stop him. The tears had dried, but the stain they left behind was permanent. Roy Maddox sat still, wrists red from friction, mouth dry from the taste of failure. He didn't speak when the door opened. He didn't blink when the officer stepped in with a clipboard. No chains rattled. No guards barked. Just the quiet finality of bureaucracy doing what it always does, erasing what no longer serves it. "You're done," the officer said, voice flat, reading from the page without looking up. Effective immediately. Terminated, badge revoked, pension frozen pending review. No appeal available, no apology, no explanation. Just 30 minutes after his arrest, Roy Maddox was no longer an officer. No hearings, no statements, no delay. Because when your sin is aimed at the symbol you once swore to protect, the system does not pause to process your excuses. It amputates, and so it did. The story reached Washington before the second shift clocked in. By the time Grant had finished a quiet breakfast, black coffee in one hand, headline in the other, the Pentagon had already issued a statement. It was brief, unapologetis, and surgically precise. No counter-response will be authorized. There is no need to retaliate against what has already disarmed itself. Justice, in this country, walks forward. It does not flinch. The press called it the cleanest statement the military ever gave, but for Grant, it read like a salute, because silence wasn't just his weapon. It had become the nation's posture. Across town, in the West Wing, a sealed envelope slid across the president's desk. Inside, a handwritten note. No official letterhead, just words personal, deliberate, almost reverent. You stood still when others would have shouted. You didn't flinch when others would have fired. And because of that, you didn't just serve this country, you anchored it. A nation doesn't stay upright because it moves fast. It stays upright because someone knows when to stay still. It was signed in pen, the highest signature in the land. Grant folded the letter once, carefully. He didn't place it in a frame. He didn't show it to anyone. He simply slid it inside a drawer and shut it, because praise, like power, should never be performed. Meanwhile, Roy was escorted through a long corridor inside the intake wing of the Federal Holding Center. He didn't speak. He didn't fight. The camera footage from that walk would later circulate. Not leaked, released, official, unedited. Roy Maddox in shackles, shoulders slightly hunched, flanked by two federal agents who didn't bother to look at him. The camera didn't follow his face. It stayed focused on the background, a long, sterile hallway. On its walls, framed portraits of decorated officers, and at the center, frozen behind glass, the image of Lieutenant Commander Ariel H. Mason. Her funeral had been the battleground, her memory, the casualty. Now, her image stared at Roy, with a stillness far more brutal than any condemnation, not because she was glaring, because she wasn't, because her eyes, forever captured in that photograph, never had to look at him, and yet he couldn't look away. The agents turned left at the final corridor. Roy didn't. He paused. 1 second, then another. Then someone nudged him forward, but not before the camera caught it, that flicker in his eyes, that brief tremor in his jaw. It wasn't guilt, it wasn't pain. It was the moment he realized what Grant had known all along. That silence doesn't forget, it just waits. Outside the compound, the gate bore a phrase carved into steel. Simple, stark. It is not the man with the gun they fear. It is the man who never needed one to win. No one knew who authored the line. It wasn't an official quote. It wasn't pulled from policy. Some said it came from a guard. Others said from a general. A few whispered it might have been Grant himself, but no one confirmed, because some truths don't need attribution. They need permanence. That was the day the headlines stopped calling Roy Maddox a former officer. They didn't call him disgraced. They didn't call him unstable. They called him unnecessary. And that, more than any sentence, was the verdict. Grant never attended the press conferences. He didn't release a statement. He went for a walk that morning, down a quiet boulevard, lined with flags. He stopped once, only once, beneath one that caught the wind at the perfect angle. It didn't snap, it didn't whip. It simply moved upward, outward, unbending. He looked up, hands in pockets, and nodded once. Not to the flag, to the idea behind it, because in a world of men who mistake noise for courage and weapons for worth, there must always be one who proves that stillness, not violence, is the final form of power. And that man never needs applause, just the right to remain still. The Hall of Justice opened not with a gavel but with the hush of boots brushing polished marble, 17 pairs in perfect cadence. They didn't look around. They didn't speak. Each wore their full military dress uniforms glinting under the courthouse chandeliers, insignias speaking louder than any oath. They took their places in the front row, silent as statues carved not from stone, but from memory. Elias Grant was not among them. He didn't need to be. Roy Maddox entered with the posture of a man both defiant and dismantled. His eyes scanned the courtroom, landing first on the judge, then on the prosecutor, and finally inevitably on the 17 soldiers who sat without shifting. He paused. He stared. Nothing moved. Not a nod. Not a blink. They weren't there to look at him. They were there to remember. The bailiff called the room to order, but the atmosphere was already set. It was a courtroom only in architecture. In tone, it was a reckoning. Maddox's lawyer, a middle-aged man, with a loosened tie and a pulse too fast for composure, stood up with a forced sense of duty. Your Honor, we motion to postpone this hearing due to the defendant's emotional instability and compromised mental state. His voice quivered, not with empathy, but with the fear of inevitability. The judge, a woman known across jurisdictions for never letting theatrics cloud her rulings, leaned forward slowly. Her reply was a scalpel. Denied. Maddox flinched. The courtroom darkened subtly as the lights dimmed for evidence. The projection screen lit up. A drone's footage appeared, time-stamped from over a decade ago. Desert terrain, smoke, screams lost to wind, and then a frame that cleaved the oxygen from the room. Roy Maddox, younger, wounded, bleeding from the leg, crawling away from a blown-out vehicle. Behind him, chaos, and through it, a figure dragging him by the vest, shielding his body with his own, Elias Grant. The footage had no sound, but it didn't need it. Grant's face wasn't entirely visible, but the tilt of his shoulders, the way he moved without hesitation, and the unflinching look in his eyes captured from an overhead angle made it clear. He hadn't just saved a man, he had defied death to do so, and that man now seated in the defendant's chair once owed his life to the very silence that was currently dismantling him. No one in the courtroom moved. The judge didn't ask for reactions. The prosecutor didn't rise to speak. The defense attorney didn't dare approach the bench again. It was not just a piece of evidence. It was an indictment written in memory, played out in slow, brutal justice. The soldiers in the front row remained still, but their silence, collective and calibrated, thundered across the marble like the report of a rifle. Maddox glanced again. Still nothing. Not a flicker of pity. He looked back at the video as it ended on Grant kneeling beside him, checking his pulse, shielding him from a second blast that never came. Then darkness. The screen faded to black, but the silence remained. The court reporter paused, hands hovering. The air did not reset. In the far rear of the room, a journalist put down her pen. The judge leaned back. No questions, no objections, no further commentary needed. Even that felt unnecessary. Everyone already knew. Maddox opened his mouth, but the words got lost somewhere between pride and panic. He turned again, eyes darting along the uniforms, as if begging for acknowledgement, recognition, even a memory that might soften what was coming. But there was only the quiet, and in that quiet lived every order he disobeyed, every hatred he nurtured, every truth he tried to bend. The silence in the room was not absent. It was present. Wait. A final judgment rendered not by argument or evidence, but by the unbearable force of what everyone already remembered. A courtroom that needed no cross-examination, no verdict yet read, and yet the sentence had already begun. The silence that followed the courtroom's unspoken verdict seeped into every newsroom like a gas leak, silent, pervasive, and lethal. But it didn't explode with headlines. Not yet. The system had learned how to whisper its sins in closed-door chambers. What made this different, what made this dangerous, was that this time the whispers were being recorded. The first to speak wasn't a journalist. It was a junior analyst at a local watchdog group, cross-referencing service records and appointment timelines, who flagged an anomaly so clean it stank. Roy Maddox's background check had a time-stamp mismatch-owned file closed before the interview it was meant to evaluate. Within 24 hours, 3 independent outlets corroborated the finding. Within 48, the nation's biggest paper ran a Sunday exposé with a headline that required no embellishment: "The Corridor of Convenience." It was no longer about Maddox alone. It was about how he got there, how a man flagged for prior misconduct, stripped of recommendation by superior officers, and red-flagged in Kandahar, still rose through the ranks to wear a badge in a city he had never earned the right to serve. The article traced the path through a carefully constructed corridor of favors, denials, and omissions. At its center stood one name that made even cynics flinch: Senator Edward Lang, Roy's father-in-law, a career lawmaker with a jawline that never shook on camera and hands that hadn't touched a real problem in decades. When asked for a statement, Lang refused. When cornered in D.C., he stepped into his car without a word. But silence, in this moment, only rang louder. Then came the email, dated 5 years earlier, unencrypted, found on the private server of a retired recruitment officer. The message was short, clinical, and almost bored. From Edward Lang: "He's got history. Sure, just wipe the stain. Don't soak the fabric." It didn't read like a cover-up. It read like a routine. The ripple hit the precinct next. 4 officers, all white men in seniority, were placed on immediate leave. Each had, at some point, signed off on reports minimizing or outright ignoring complaints filed against Maddox. Their justifications varied: insufficient evidence, uncorroborated testimonies, internal resolution achieved. Now those signatures became indictments. Their shields didn't protect them. They branded them. By midweek, the Department of Justice confirmed an internal investigation into appointment irregularities within regional law enforcement agencies. The language was dry, but the subtext was fire. Then came the press conference. The director of the FBI stood at the podium, unsmiling, without the luxury of metaphor. Her statement was precise, carved out of institutional shame, and delivered like a scalpel. We are not here because of one gun. We are here because of the finger that pulled it, and the hand that allowed it to hold authority. This is not about a rogue officer. This is about a system that chambered the round. No follow-up questions were taken. There was none to be asked. Maddox, still behind bars, watched the statement in a locked rec room with 3 other inmates. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. His lawyer didn't return media calls. His wife filed for divorce the next morning. Lang's office released a brief statement. The senator will fully cooperate with any lawful inquiry. It was read aloud on national television by a press aide who couldn't meet the camera. But the wound had already been opened, and no one was offering stitches. In classrooms, students debated the ethics of legacy appointments. In precincts, junior officers started scrubbing their records, terrified of being next. In politics, committee chairs shifted nervously in their seats, reviewing old favors through a new lens. And through it all, Grant remained unseen. He did not comment, he did not appear, he did not need to. The weight of his silence now bent steel. Systems were recalibrating not because he commanded them to, but because he had exposed what they were willing to protect, not out of error, out of design. This wasn't a scandal. It was a diagnosis. And when the diagnosis settled, when the body politic stopped reeling from the revelation of its infection, the courtroom resumed its quiet incisions. No pageantry, no spectacle, just the slow, meticulous slicing of ideology from the man who once screamed it into the faces of cadets. Roy Maddox stood before the bench, fingers twitching, the outline of a broken man wearing the remains of a defiant shell. He cleared his throat, lips parted, and tried to summon the illusion of remorse. "Your Honor, I just wanted to say," the judge didn't let him finish. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her tone had the precision of a guillotine. "You are not on trial for what you said. You are here because you held your weapon while staying silent." The words hit like brass. Maddox froze, stunned by the speed of his irrelevance. He had spent a lifetime believing that silence was neutrality, that not pulling the trigger absolved the act of pointing it, that as long as he didn't say the word, he could not be condemned for the thought. But she had stripped that lie from him in a single sentence. He wasn't being punished for his speech. He was being judged for his posture. The lights dimmed again. A second video began to play, this one grainy, older, recorded in the harsh floodlights of a training field. A younger Maddox paced before a line of recruits, rage bubbling beneath his every syllable. "Out here, guns talk first." The footage paused on his face, twisted, red, spit flying as he barked his warped gospel, a doctrine of dominance, captured, archived, and now weaponized against him. The judge didn't turn to the screen. She didn't have to. She kept her eyes on Maddox, and with a voice sharpened by civic fury, declared, "We are here to prove that in a court of law, authority is not measured in muzzle velocity." No one clapped, no one gasped. The room had already transcended reaction. This was not a theater. This was reckoning. Maddox broke. His shoulders shook, not with rage but with the desperation of a man who had finally seen the mirror held up to him and found not guilt but rot. He sobbed, uncontrolled, unguarded, grotesque, but it was too late for humanity. The room had already moved past him, eyes averted, not out of pity, but rejection. No one offered tissue. No one offered sympathy. His tears soaked into the suit of a man who thought fear was control. What made the moment unrelenting was the absence of cruelty. There were no jeers, no mocking stares, just the weight of collective memory refusing to make room for his redemption. And still, the judge wasn't done. She leaned forward, voice lower now, but cutting deeper. The law does not punish mere action. It punishes belief left unchallenged. Yours festered for 17 years, and no one stopped you. But now, it stops here. No one moved, not even the court reporter. It was as if the room itself had paused to feel the shift. A man's ideology had been tried and found guilty, not because he acted, but because he believed he had the right to act. And for the first time, Roy Maddox understood. The silence he once wielded like a shield had become the noose, not for his body, for his legacy. And when the ideology had been sentenced, the law returned not as a scalpel this time, but as a hammer. The judge didn't pause. She didn't lean back for dramatic effect. She simply lifted the file, turned one page, and read the sentence with the clinical precision of history being carved into stone. Life imprisonment, no parole, no negotiation, no exceptions. Each word struck the air like iron hitting iron. The courtroom did not stir, not even the rustle of fabric. It was as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, aware that something unprecedented had just occurred. A police officer, federally charged, not for what he did, but for what he believed he could do and for the silence that weaponized that belief. Maddox recoiled as if the words had weight. He lunged forward, eyes wild, with the disbelief of a man raised to think the law was a mirror, not a sword. His voice cracked like glass under pressure. "Why? I didn't fire. I never pulled the trigger." The courtroom remained frozen, the judge unblinking, her gavel untouched. But it wasn't her voice that answered. From the corner of the room, where uniform met law and silence met clarity, the military liaison stepped forward. A colonel, his insignia sharp against his navy blue, spoke with a cadence that came not from the need to convince, but from the authority of truth. "Because you believed you had the right to pull it." That belief, in that moment, in that uniform, with that power, was the most dangerous weapon in the room. The gallery did not gasp. They didn't need to. The truth wasn't shocking. It was sobering. There were no cries for leniency, no murmurs of injustice. What hung over the courtroom now was not satisfaction, nor revenge, but the chill of a lesson too long delayed. For the first time in recorded federal judicial history, an officer of the law had been sentenced without ever discharging his weapon. And yet no one questioned the verdict, because in a society saturated with bloodshed, the unspent bullet that lives in the chamber of a man convinced of his impunity is more terrifying than the one already fired. Maddox collapsed into his seat, lips moving, perhaps in prayer, perhaps in protest, but the room had already stopped listening. His name, his title, his arguments, they no longer mattered. What remained was the precedent. The gravity was no longer his burden alone. It belonged to every office that had ever let a man like him through the gates, every system that had rewarded obedience without question, and every silence that had masqueraded as professionalism. The judge stood, her robe folding around her like a final curtain. She didn't look at Maddox again. She looked toward the gallery, the flags, and the camera. "Let this be understood," she said, her voice echoing like verdicts passed. "The law does not wait for the shot to ring out. It acts when the threat is imagined, the intent crystallized, the dignity endangered. The courtroom is not a battlefield, but it knows the contours of war." Then she walked out. No applause followed, no movement. The people in attendance sat as if attending a memorial, not a trial, and in a way they were. A death had occurred not of a man, but of an illusion. The illusion that authority without accountability could exist in the light. Heads bowed, not in mourning, but in recognition. The system had spoken, and for once, it had chosen to remember, not protect. Behind Maddox, the shadows grew long, like prison bars stretching into memory. The camera lights dimmed. The court reporter packed her machine, and the words "no exceptions" continued to echo not just in the courthouse, but across a nation that had waited too long to hear them. The echoes of the sentence still clung to the corners of Maddox's cell like smoke that refused to clear. Days passed, though no one marked them aloud. The lights came on, meals arrived, doors are locked and unlocked, but within that cycle, something broke, not a scream, not a confession, but a compulsion. He began to write. It started with a single sheet, pulled from the back of a legal pad, provided more out of protocol than mercy. Maddox's handwriting was small, controlled, and obsessive. He addressed it carefully. "Elias Grant, C.O. Military Liaison Division." The words moved slowly, as if crawling uphill against his pride. He didn't ask for forgiveness, not directly, but the plea was woven into every space between lines. "I request the chance to see you," he wrote, "just once. I want to say it to your face. I need to understand what you saw in that moment, what I did to deserve that silence." He folded it carefully, hands shaking more from memory than regret. The letter was logged, mailed. 3 days later, a guard slid an envelope under his door. No stamp, no seal, just the name, Grant. Inside was a single line, typed, not handwritten. "I don't visit men who once pointed a weapon at me and now beg for the weight of their redemption. I did not come for apologies. I let the system do what needed doing." There was no signature, only the silence of refusal. Maddox stared at it for hours, the page curling slightly at the edges as the cell's air drained what little warmth remained. He read it again, and then, something in him recoiled not in anger, but in disbelief, that Grant wouldn't even offer him the dignity of rage. So he wrote again. This time, the letters were sharper, slashed into the page, like cuts made out of questions. If you won't see me, then at least answer this. Why aren't you angry? You had every right to hate me. Why didn't you take it? The second reply came faster. Same envelope, same lack of seal, same restraint. One sentence. I was angry, but you're not worthy of housing that emotion in me for longer than it took to name it. That was all. No fanfare, no philosophical musing, no attempt to teach, just a cold, surgical extraction of attachment. Grant didn't grant closure. He removed the need for it. Maddox sat with the paper clutched in both hands, crumpling the edge without realizing it. He didn't cry this time. There was no energy left for theatrics. He simply stood, walked to the corner of his cell, where the vent hummed like a distant radio, and lit the pages one by one. The flames danced without celebration. They consumed without hesitation. The camera above didn't blink. It watched as he burned every word he had written, every reply he had received. But before the final page turned to ash, Maddox paused, stared into the flickering light, and did something the system would log without ever understanding. He smiled, not the smile of absolution, not defiance, not peace. It was the grim curl of a man who finally recognized that his fate was not the loss of freedom, but the permanence of judgment. The smirk of someone who realized no scream, no letter, no courtroom plea would ever unring the verdict that had already been written across the nation's memory. He was no longer a villain to be feared. He was a caution carved into stone, and even that, Grant had refused to attend. Even after the last letter had turned to ash, and the smile of acknowledgement faded into concrete corners, Elias Grant remained untouched by spectacle. While headlines shrieked, panels debated, and justice departments reorganized their doctrine, Grant continued to walk the halls of silence, dignified not by retreat but by restraint. So when the invitation arrived from the National Military Academy, signed in ink, addressed by hand, and sealed with the insignia of a nation still licking the wound of its conscience, there was no fanfare, no announcement. He accepted without hesitation, not because he needed to speak, but because they needed to hear. The auditorium wasn't grand, it was functional, Spartan. Rows of cadets in pressed uniforms sitting so straight they looked stitched into the seats. They had read about him, studied the footage, debated the doctrine. But this was different. This was the presence of a man who had stood still under threat, and by doing so, made the trigger irrelevant. He entered without salute, without an escort. His uniform was impeccable, but unadorned by choice. No ribbons, no rank displayed, just the quiet gravity of a man whose silence had already reordered the moral compass of command. He stood at the center of the stage, not behind a podium, but in the open-O barrier, no armor. The room fell into a hush that bordered on reverence. No introduction was needed. For 5 full minutes, Grant said nothing. He scanned the room, meeting eyes, not judging, measuring. And then, a cadet near the back, sharp, young, with the kind of voice that cracked between curiosity and courage, raised a hand. "Sir," he asked, "why didn't you say anything when he pointed the gun at you?" The silence stretched again, but this time with intent. Grant didn't lower his gaze. He let the question hover, let it bloom in the room like smoke that wouldn't clear. 3 seconds passed. Then he spoke, slowly, softly. But the words landed like architecture. "Because the man who thinks he has the right to kill," he said, "is always terrified of the one who doesn't need to lift a finger to make his hands shake." No murmur followed, no scribbling of notes, just the sound of breath being held by an entire room that suddenly understood why history is not always written in action. Sometimes it is carved from stillness. Grant didn't say another word. He didn't need to. He nodded once to the cadet, then to the rest, and left the stage with the same silence he brought in. The moment didn't vanish. It didn't fade. It crystallized. Months later, when the curriculum for the next year was published, the cover of the military ethics syllabus bore no seal, no motto, no flag, only a single sentence, printed in white ink against a black field. "Because the man who thinks he has the right to kill is always terrified of the one who doesn't need to lift a finger to make his hands shake." No attribution, none needed. Everyone knew who said it, and why it could never be forgotten. It began not with fire, nor with rage, but with a single keystroke. Somewhere deep inside the administrative database of the Boston Police Department, the entry was opened, not by a headline, not by demand, but as a matter of routine. A clerk, faceless, nameless, functionally invisible, scrolled to the letter M, then to Maddox, Roy Allen, badge number 11702B. The commendation line was long: valor, bravery, outstanding conduct, all dated, all documented, all undone. One line after another was deleted, not revised, not edited, erased. Commendations were reclassified as pending review, then as null, then removed entirely. Finally, the name itself, not the record but the name. It was struck, not overwritten, not hidden behind legal shielding, simply gone, a blank field where a man had once inserted himself into the narrative of public safety. The Hall of Honor at Precinct Headquarters, once a place for silent salutes and careful pride, replaced his portrait with a bronze plaque of abstract lines. No caption, no dedication, just geometry. No one explained why. They didn't have to. In state archives, the update cascaded. The service transcript now began and ended with one line: terminated, conduct inconsistent with constitutional oath. No footnotes, no links, just a hard stop. His name was not whispered in roll call, not cursed, not praised. It simply ceased to appear. In annual briefings, his case was referred to only by its legal ID. Federal Case 729, Alpha Lima. Among internal training modules, a new case study was uploaded: The Risk of Unchecked Authority, with all identifying details redacted. Even the face was blurred. Within the prison walls, the transformation was colder. Uniforms stitched not with names, but with code. 94,403L replaced what once required syllables. When the food tray was delivered, the guard called 4 Lima. No one turned their head in confusion. At intake for new hires in the Department of Justice, an orientation video made reference to a former officer whose sense of privilege eclipsed his sense of duty. There was no name, but the footage, brief as it was, showed a corridor, a drawn weapon, a funeral flag, and then nothing. Fade to black. The American Police Commemorative Foundation revised its honoree list. Asterisks appeared next to 3 prior recipients. One footnote read, "Award rescinded following federal ruling of dishonorable conduct." Again, no names, just the subtraction of glory. Inside the penitentiary, a new guard, young, freshly trained, voice still searching for authority, turned to the operations chief while reviewing the roster. He pointed at the blank space where a real name should have been, furrowing his brow. "Who's 94,403L? The chief didn't look up, didn't pause. "A cautionary tale," he said flatly. "Not a man, and that was it. Not disgrace, not humiliation, erasure, no flames, no riots. Just the quiet precision of systemic deletion. The name didn't rot in shame. It dissolved in protocol, gone from the walls, from badges, from lips. Legacy wasn't buried. It was denied the dignity of even being remembered incorrectly. And in its place, only a vacancy, a lesson. What vanished in files and plaques reappeared in questions. The name may have been erased, but the memory lingered, not as myth, not as martyrdom, but as caution, a shadow that moved only when light shifted. And in one corner of that shifting landscape, a cadet stood who had once simply pressed record. The footage, captured not with intent but with instinct, had become the linchpin. A young police academy student, barely 20, with a cracked phone screen and a stare that held more clarity than many who wore brass, had lifted his arm and caught it all. The funeral, the scream, the gun, the stillness. He hadn't flinched. He hadn't looked away. He hadn't shouted. He just captured what no one else dared to frame. Months later, he was invited to speak, not as a hero, not as a symbol, but as a witness who had chosen not to lie to his own eyes. He stood at the front of the Academy auditorium, nervous, not because of the crowd, but because of the silence it gave him. Uniforms filled the rows. Instructors, administrators, young recruits who had all seen the footage and memorized the stillness of a man who refused to obey fear. "I didn't record it to accuse anyone," he said, his voice unpolished but firm. "I recorded it because I couldn't pretend I didn't see it. There was no thunderous applause, no music swelled, but one by one, without prompting, every student in the room stood. It wasn't orchestrated, it wasn't rehearsed. It simply happened as if to say, not in words, but in posture, "We saw it too, and we will not pretend otherwise." The cadet didn't bow, he didn't smile, he just stepped down, walking past instructors who nodded without needing to speak. The moment wasn't historic, it was human. Later that month, a portrait was hung in the main hall of the academy, not ornate, not oversized, just a simple framed photograph of Elias Grant, mid-stride, head held high, eyes fixed on something the frame could not capture. Beneath it, a single line: "He did not turn away, so we do not look away." The lecture halls were never silent, but on that morning, they became still. Screens dimmed not by design but by intent, as instructors paused mid-sentence, allowing the weight of what lingered to settle across the rows of uniforms and uncreased manuals. It wasn't part of the planned module. No bullet point on the schedule read ethics by absence, yet somehow, every cadet present understood the gravity of the footage before it even played. The frame came slowly grainy at first, edges frayed by time, but focused at its center. A young man, no older than most in the room, standing without weapon, without command, yet with a posture that made rifles hesitate. His name wasn't on the screen. It didn't need to be. The lesson wasn't about who he was, it was about what he had chosen to see. That morning, he had been the only one to not flinch when an officer raised a weapon during a ceremony meant for silence. The officer's shout, "Step back or I'll fire," was captured on audio, now used as a case study not for escalation, but for exposure. What followed was not chaos, but a freeze. The young man didn't raise his hands. He didn't protest. He just stood, eyes forward, unmoved and unarmed. That image alone rewrote expectations. A month later, a regional police chief was forced to resign after mocking the footage in a leaked email, referring to it as performance stoicism. The backlash was immediate. Veterans called for his removal, survivors of military families held silent vigils outside his precinct, and when he attempted to walk through a local town square, children turned their backs in choreographed silence. In another state, a municipal judge who had dismissed charges against the officer in the video was confronted during a public forum. She tried to explain procedural nuances, but was met only with the replayed image projected onto the wall behind her. No audio, no commentary, just presence. The silence in that room was heavier than her defense. A third incident surfaced when a training officer, bitter over the changing tides, publicly destroyed a printed copy of the photo during a seminar. He called it emotional propaganda. The clip, recorded by a trainee, went viral within hours. He was suspended indefinitely, and his past disciplinary record, previously sealed, was leaked and dissected by news outlets with a precision usually reserved for war crime coverage. But perhaps the most pointed response came from a girl no older than 16 who stood outside her school board's meeting after the district refused to include the image in its ethics curriculum. She didn't shout. She didn't carry a sign. She stood alone, in the same posture, holding only a single sheet of paper with no text, just the printed image. Reporters arrived. Questions were asked. She said nothing. The footage aired that evening. The next morning, the district reversed its decision. The photo wasn't just remembered, it was recited without words. In academies, they began to refer to it not as the image or the incident, but simply as the standard. Instructors began their sessions with no preface, just projection, followed by silence. It wasn't long before the approach spread military programs, law enforcement briefings, even university seminars on leadership and governance. No one mandated it, but no one questioned it either, because what had once been a moment became a reference point, a nonverbal policy. The cadet in the video never gave interviews, he never wrote a memoir, but his quiet defiance, unadorned and uncompromising, was the foundation upon which a generation relearned command. The image replaced hundreds of pages of code. The posture replaced hours of simulation. And those who saw it began to understand what hadn't been taught before, that authority doesn't always come with volume. Sometimes, it arrives in restraint. That photo, that stillness, became an underground scripture. Even now, years later, in remote precincts and frontline classrooms, it gets passed along in USB drives, etched onto training coins, whispered across cafeteria tables by those just beginning their paths. Not because it was assigned, because it resonated, because it told a truth that uniforms couldn't shield against, nor ranks overshadow. It became the answer to questions no handbook dared ask. And the cadet, whose name was never announced, whose actions were never choreographed, continued to lead without returning. The words weren't quoted, they weren't assigned to anyone, they simply existed, like a standard that didn't need to be explained. That image, the quiet walk, the unflinching gazebos quietly added to the national curriculum for law enforcement ethics, not as a directive, as a reference. No captions, no title, just context. And those who saw it knew this was not a lesson in power. It was a lesson in posture, and it came not from orders, but from a cadet who understood that silence isn't the absence of choice, it's a form of it. The photo, the footage, the phrase, they moved from institution to institution, not through policy, but through resonance. They weren't broadcast, they were whispered, shared, remembered, because when a young man chooses to see, he doesn't just record history, he redirects it. It followed quietly, as expected, no press release, no retirement ceremony, no folded flag, or commemorative plaque. Elias Grant retired the same way he had lived, without demand, without spectacle, without compromise. One morning, his name disappeared from the active personnel registry of the Department of Defense. No one announced it. No one needed to. The silence that replaced his title was not vacancy, was inheritance. A week later, a national newspaper printed an editorial titled simply, "The Ones Who Leave Without a Shadow." It wasn't adorned with political commentary or dramatic prose. It was lean, purposeful, and in it, the writer stated, "Some men retire by stepping down. Others do so by raising the standard so high that stepping down becomes unnecessary." Grant did not leave a post, he left a measurement. But between those lines and beyond that sentiment, the quiet arc of consequence continued bending across institutions like a slow fire under concrete. In a televised town hall, a former city administrator who had once called the Grant case a masterclass in public overreaction attempted to pivot her narrative, suggesting that policy had gone too far in sanctifying stillness. Yet during her broadcast, the ticker below her name flashed an unexpected correction. Former deputy, role eliminated following internal review. Viewers paused, screenshots circulated, and by evening, her sponsors had withdrawn in sequence. She issued a statement the next morning, but it never made the front page. In a police training academy in Colorado, a long-standing instructor known for his harsh doctrine and thinly veiled disdain for restraint training was recorded mocking the Grant Protocol in a private session. He told recruits, "You want to get home alive? Don't freeze like that man did. That's not courage. That's theater." The recording leaked online, paired with the image of Grant standing still beneath the canopy, a gun aimed at his back. The instructor was placed on immediate leave. By the end of the month, his position had been dissolved, his office reassigned to a newly promoted cadet who had once written a thesis on de-escalation tactics zone, footnoted entirely without mention of Grant, but filled with echoes of his presence. Elsewhere, at a national conference on tactical ethics, a keynote speaker known for his controversial stance against what he termed the elevation of passivity in modern policing found his audience thinning mid-speech. Not in protest, not in anger, just in absence. Row after row, attendees gathered their belongings and walked out in near silence. By the time he finished his final paragraph, only 3 chairs were filled, 2 of them by volunteers responsible for cleanup. No article reported it, but video from a phone in the back recorded the emptiness. The clip, uploaded without comment, reached 1 million views in 4 days. The speaker was not invited back the following year. Even in academia, the tremor was felt. At a private university in the Northeast, a senior fellow published an op-ed suggesting that silence, though dramatic, should never replace command. The backlash came not through protests or rebuttals, but through a gradual withdrawal. Alumni ceased donations, students requested alternative advisors, invitations to speak at affiliated institutions dried up. When asked by a student why his lecture hall was half full, he paused before answering, "Because silence travels faster than words now." And through all of it, Grant remained absent, not aloof, not hidden, just unreachable. When the Department of Defense extended an offer to hold a quiet ceremony in his honor, no media, no speeches, just a flag flown, at half-mast this written response was a single sentence. My departure was not an event. It was printed, unsigned, and archived in internal correspondence. No one leaked it. They didn't have to. The message filtered through tone, through posture, through institutional adjustment. In military circles, his name was used less like a title and more like a unit of measure. Hold it like Grant, one instructor said during a field simulation when a young recruit hesitated at the threshold of a mock riot. The recruit straightened his spine, stepped forward, and said nothing. No one explained what that meant, but everyone recognized it, even those who had never met the man, especially them. A new kind of influence had taken root not through recognition, but through reference, not through visibility, but through velocity. And in the rooms where decisions are made, where policies are edited, and where new cadets are shown grainy footage of a figure who didn't flinch, the standard was no longer measured by escalation, but by the ability to absorb threat without reflecting it. So the editorial did not overreach. It did not exaggerate. It did not dramatize a man who had no interest in being dramatized. It only concluded what had already become evident across sectors, departments, and generations still learning to tell the difference between noise and necessity. Some men retire by stepping down. Others do so by raising the standard so high that stepping down becomes unnecessary. Grant did not leave a post. He left a measurement. The Department of Defense sent him a formal letter requesting permission to issue a Medal of Distinguished Civilian Service. The envelope arrived crisp, with embossed gold trim, signed personally by the secretary. The letter remained unopened on Grant's kitchen counter for 4 days before he returned it with a single line scrawled in pen across the front. I don't need an award for standing still. The statement was neither proud nor bitter. It was simply a refusal to dilute stillness into something transactional. His silence had never been strategic. It had been elemental, not because he feared speaking, but because what needed to be said had already been made visible through how he moved, how he stood, and more importantly, how he chose not to react. He did not attend interviews. He did not join panels. He declined book deals. When reached for comment by a national security columnist, his only reply was, "My comment was in the stillness." Across the social spectrum, his silence drew a quiet reckoning. In a television segment, once hosted by a former law enforcement analyst who had dismissed Grant's actions as non-compliance dressed as principle, the host found herself uninvited from the network's renewed ethics coverage series. Days later, she appeared on a lesser-viewed online stream, visibly defensive, retelling her version of the incident, but viewers clipped an earlier segment tone in which she laughed at the notion of restraint and juxtaposed it against footage of Grant unmoving beneath the flag-draped canopy. The video went viral. Comment sections filled with the same line, "He didn't flinch. She couldn't listen." At a military convention in the South, an ex-commander who once used Grant's name as a cautionary tale in training, calling him the poster child for overcorrecting, was asked to step down after a transcript of his remarks resurfaced during the event's debrief. His statements, peppered with sarcasm and laced with disdain for any form of silence, struck a discordant note in a year where tactical pause had become the central thesis of every new manual. The committee issued a statement not of apology, but of alignment. Silence is not absence. It is present, restrained. A think tank once affiliated with strategic policing reform released a report subtly implying Grant's inaction endangered lives. The report included doctored response times and omitted video footage context. A former intern exposed the edits, and the document was swiftly retracted. The think tank's director resigned within the week. But what haunted the organization wasn't just the retraction, it was the internal memo leaked by a staffer, highlighting the fear that truth without performance can't survive headlines. That sentence, more than any other, became a screenshot shared alongside Grant's Imagiman standing without gesture, without sound, and yet with undeniable gravity. Even among skeptics, the silence began reshaping language. At a closed-door gathering of federal negotiators, one speaker known for his aggressive style paused midway through a simulated conflict debrief and simply said, "This is where Grant would have waited." The room went quiet, No one challenged the moment, and from then on, hesitation became less about uncertainty and more about control. Grant's absence from every podium became its own form of presence, so loud that it could be quoted without being spoken. The publisher of a major political biography series reached out to him 3 times, each offer accompanied by escalating advances and assurances of full editorial control. The final proposal included co-authoring with a decorated journalist and a guarantee of a national tour. Grant didn't reply to the email. He returned the contract with nothing but a straight black line drawn through the signature block. No note, no explanation. The silence was the reply. When the publisher later issued a public statement lamenting his refusal, readers responded not with outrage but with clarity, posting segments from his public footage, each captioned with variations of a phrase that had become cultural shorthand. "He didn't need a book. We already read him." Meanwhile, a former precinct captain once, a vocal opponent of the Grant Protocol, attempted a media comeback by asserting that restraint was making officers hesitant to act. His interview was cut short when the host redirected the conversation, quoting a line from the Grant file that had never made national headlines but had lived quietly in the training documents. "Courage isn't louder, it's longer." The captain's face faltered. Ratings for the segment plummeted. 2 days later, his department announced it would fully adopt the Grant standards, effective immediately. So when Grant refused the medal, it wasn't defiance, it was clarity. A man who did not need a platform refused to let anyone build one for him. He understood something most leaders forget, that stillness doesn't scale, but it resonates. That, once a line has been drawn with restraint, its echo can be louder than any declaration. His rejection of legacy crafting wasn't bitterness, it was integrity. His statement, "My comment was," in the stillness became a citation in policy memos, a headline in articles, and a mural caption beneath his silhouette in cities he'd never visited. It wasn't what he said, it was how he remained silent while the world shifted around him, and in that stillness, the shape of a new standard quietly formed. And so the country responded in the only way it could, by reflecting. Months later, a bronze statue was quietly unveiled at the National Military Cemetery. No ribbon cutting, no anthems, just an open field, early morning, wind brushing the shoulders of a few silent attendees. The statue depicted no action. It was not a pose of defiance or heroism. It was Grant, as he had stood that day, head slightly turned, shoulders relaxed, hands by his side. No weapon, no salute, just presence. The inscription at the base said nothing about service years, ranks, or medals. It read, "Never aim a weapon at dignity." People didn't gather around it for photographs. They stood in front of it the way they might stand at a gravesite, not to mourn, but to remember what ought never to be forgotten. Veterans brought their children, officers brought their cadets, educators brought their silence. And yet, for all the reverence and stillness, the nation had not finished asking itself who exactly had tried to pull the trigger that day. At a closed-door congressional hearing, an oversight committee interrogated the incident from every angle. The footage was played 13 times. One representative demanded to know why no one had physically intervened sooner, as if courage were a matter of stepping forward only once a headline was guaranteed. Another asked if Grant had provoked the officer by refusing to comply, conveniently ignoring the fact that compliance had never been the issue. The officer who had drawn the gun, Captain Reese Langdon, was present via video feed. When asked why he had aimed, he claimed perceived threat, but when the committee requested documentation of such training protocol, none existed. What did exist, however, was an internal email sent the night before. Langdon had written, "Some of these veterans think they're above protocol. Let's remind them who's in charge." The leak of that email, shared by a junior aide, went viral within hours. It was reposted by veterans, journalists, and even middle school civics teachers who projected it in classrooms with the caption, "This is what arrogance looks like in uniform." The second incident came weeks later at a university campus. During a guest lecture on leadership ethics, a retired general mentioned Grant's name as an example of restraint and command. A senior faculty member scoffed audibly, then said, "That's not leadership, that's passivity dressed in posture." A student recorded the moment. The video, captioned, "Professor dismisses silence as weakness sparked outrage." Veterans groups flooded the university's social media, not with threats or anger, but with their photos. standing at grave sites, flags folded, medals untouched. They wrote, "This is what restraint looks like. Ask who taught it to us." The third moment erupted at a city police academy. A trainee requested to wear a patch honoring the Grant Protocol during his field assignments. The request was denied. The supervising officer called it political theater. The cadet was later suspended for noncompliance, but when the disciplinary memo leaked, its phrasing ignited a firestorm. It read, "The department does not endorse figures who challenge the rightful application of force." National media seized it. Evening segments turned it into a rhetorical grenade. Does this mean restraint is now defiance? The fourth came not from any scandal but from absence. At a televised debate between gubernatorial candidates, the topic of police reform came up. One candidate, flustered by pressure to articulate a vision, said, "We don't need statues. We need stronger responses." The moderator calmly replied, "You mean stronger than not drawing a weapon?" Silence followed, then applause. Not because of politics, but because the audience had remembered. They had remembered what had not been fired, and in the quiet aftermath, the statue stood. Grant's image cast a long shadow as the sun moved behind it. Instructors led tours past it without speaking. Families stopped without prompting. Recruits paused, unsure if they were allowed to move beyond it. And though nothing about the figure had changed, its meaning evolved. It had become a threshold, a test, a point of comparison for every decision made where a weapon was present but not used. Some called him a hero, others a symbol, but neither title quite fit. He wasn't a story to be celebrated, he was a question to be asked in every institution that believed loudness equaled leadership. In the quiet corners of legislative buildings, where marble echoed with footsteps instead of proclamations, the name wasn't spoken but it was there. When newly elected officials passed by the large framed charter near the chamber doors, many paused. It bore no seal, no politician's signature, only a short directive in plain font. Authority must never precede understanding. No citation followed, but the implication loomed larger than law. In a courthouse in Virginia, a seasoned judge paused mid-sentence during a heated sentencing hearing and simply gestured toward the words carved into the oak behind him. The prosecutor, who had been pressing for a mandatory minimum, stumbled for a moment before shifting his tone entirely. A young black public defender in the back of the courtroom looked down at her pen, stopped writing, and just breathed. At a press conference meant to restore trust after a widely circulated video showed officers pushing an unarmed mourner to the ground, the police commissioner began with a prepared speech. But midway through, a reporter from a local channel, barely 23, interrupted with a single line, "Would this have happened if someone in the room remembered what restraint looks like?" The question, unbecoming by decorum standard, did not make it into the evening's televised coverage, but it made it into every transcript sent to congressional offices that afternoon. The commissioner never finished his remarks. In a school district in South Dakota, a newly approved social science curriculum included a single session titled "The Day Nothing Was Done." The Tachera veteran of 2 decades who had watched her brother dishonorably discharged for disobeying an unlawful command began the session by projecting a still image of a funeral canopy, windless, somber, steady. She said nothing for the first 7 minutes. The students, restless at first, fell gradually into silence. A boy in the back raised his hand, then lowered it. No one explained the image. It didn't need explanation. The syllabus didn't reference Grant's name. It only assigned a written reflection titled "The Ethics of Stillness." Every student turned theirs in on time. Elsewhere, a viral moment unfolded not in action, but in absence. A mayor up for re-election arrived at a televised debate with the intent of undermining his opponent, a former community organizer known for his association with the Grant Protocol. In a final volley meant to delegitimize her, he sneered into the microphone, "Silence isn't leadership, it's cowardice." The crowd reacted not with boos or cheers but with a visible withdrawal of presence. Rows of veterans in uniform turned their faces away. A camera operator focused on the face of a young woman in the front row, jaw clenched, eyes dry. Within 48 hours, the mayor's campaign was suspended. His sponsor, a national PAC, known for its aggressive rhetoric, issued a public apology, citing a failure to read the room. At a film festival in Austin, a documentary titled "Still Frame" premiered without a trailer, without a press junket, without a red carpet. It was funded by anonymous donors and closed with a single shot, the original footage of a man standing, unmoving, under a canopy beside a casket, the camera never panning, never zooming. The credits rolled in silence. Not a single critic stood to clap, but none left their seats. It was a quiet, uncomfortable acclaim that followed quiet because anything louder would have felt dishonest. In the years that followed, when recruits hesitated before escalating, when politicians were urged to pause before invoking authority, and when civilians began to differentiate between noise and strength, the statute wasn't cited, it was remembered. And in the air of its presence, a generation learned that speaking is not the only form of resistance. Sometimes, the man who doesn't speak writes the loudest sentence of them all. And so the man who didn't speak faded into the edges of public life but not into absence. His silence had been louder than commands, steadier than outrage, and what followed was not a celebration. It was a correction. It began slowly, almost invisibly, like frost tracing its way across glass. In a small town on the outskirts of Texas, a sergeant who once defended Maddox in a public for rummaging the footage as selective editing found himself reassigned without warning to a storage post 3 counties away, his locker cleared out before he arrived. No one addressed it aloud, but the message traveled faster than orders. Align yourself with what was disavowed, and the structure will erase you with the same efficiency it once empowered you. In Virginia, a police chief who had previously awarded Maddox a departmental citation was asked, mid-interview on local radio, whether he regretted the commendation. When he hesitated, just for a second too long, sponsors pulled their support within 24 hours, and his resignation was processed before the end of the week. The footage didn't need to resurface. The culture had shifted enough that silence in the wrong direction was no longer treated as neutrality. At a community college in Ohio, a criminology professor criticized the idolization of inaction, suggesting Grant had done nothing but stand still and get lucky. Within a week, students organized a walkout not with banners, not with slogans, but with mass withdrawals from his class. Enrollment dropped by 80%, no formal campaign followed, no administrative memo circulated, yet by the following semester, his name was no longer listed on the faculty page. Meanwhile, a well-known podcast host who joked about Grant's statue-worthy shoulders as America's new religion of restraint attempted to pivot his remarks into satire, only to find his sponsors had terminated their contracts without discussion. His platform, once teeming with subscribers, dwindled into static. The impact was not legal, it was atmospheric. Society had not turned into a tribunal, it had become something far less forgiving, a mirror. And in that reflection, those who once stood unbothered by abuse of posture now found themselves defined by their hesitation. Grant, however, remained unacknowledged in all official languages. No medals, no interviews, no invitations to explain. Yet his presence shaped the new silence, a benchmark against which the balance between power and dignity was now measured. In precincts, instructors rewrote protocols without needing to cite him. In courtrooms, attorneys quoted the act without invoking the moment that birthed it. He had ceased to be a name and become a boundary. And so it was not with applause but with procedural ink that the shift became permanent. A new federal statute passed through both houses with unusual speed. Quietly titled the Ceremonial Space Conduct Standard Act, it defined the limits of authority within spaces marked by national mourning. Military funerals, civic memorials, public processions, all now protected by codified restraint. No weapons drawn, no commands issued unless in defense of life. Silence, finally, had been written into law. The text didn't mention him. It didn't have to. Soon after, both the Department of Defense and the National Police Training Commission launched a joint initiative. A new curriculum required for all officers assigned to ceremonial or high-tension environments. The name of the program was printed at the top of every briefing folder in bold, unadorned type, the Grant Protocol. In a training facility in the Midwest, a class of recruits sat through the orientation. Projectors glowed, manuals stacked high, procedures mapped out with forensic clarity. At the end of the first session, a young recruit raised his hand. His tone was casual, but honest. "Why is it named after him?" The instructor didn't answer immediately. He stepped to the front of the room, then pointed toward a single image projected behind him, a still frame of a man standing motionless under a funeral canopy, eyes level, shoulders loose, a firearm aimed at his back. But what preceded that moment lived silently inside the folds of their collective knowledge, and behind that singular stillness stood 1,000 fractures that no curriculum could ever fully contain. One of the recruits in that room had read, almost reluctantly, about a judge in Tennessee who once dismissed the earliest internal warnings about Maddox, claiming officers with edge make better street instincts only to be removed from the bench after public pressure mounted when his old ruling resurfaced, paired with screenshots of a private chat log where he had written, "Still think Grant overreacted." The leak came not from whistleblowers, but from a junior clerk who found the chat log buried in the recycle bin of a state-issued laptop, a discovery that ended with security escorting the judge out the back of the courthouse in a rain-soaked coat, face half hidden, past a line of veterans who did not shout, but simply turned their backs as he passed. Another cadet had seen the clip of a retired precinct captain, once lauded for his tactical discipline, who had mocked Grant's silence on a late-night talk show, calling it passive cowardice, dressed up in moral fabric. Less than 48 hours later, his consulting firm lost 3 major city contracts, not because of direct backlash, but because mid-level procurement officers quietly removed him from every approved vendor list without bothering to explain. What followed wasn't a protest. It was the cooling absence of tolerance. And further still, in a quiet town in upstate New York, a mural once painted to honor fallen officers had contained Maddox's name in its lower corner until one night, a group of veterans, unannounced, returned with scaffolding, paint, and drop cloths, and worked in silence until dawn. The next morning, the name was gone, replaced with a quote carved in soft gray. "Some silence is louder than shots." No one took credit. The city council, when questioned, offered only a shrug. "We didn't approve it, we didn't stop it." Perhaps the most brutal reaction came in the form least visible. A university's ethics conference once scheduled a panel titled "Force, Restraint, and the Problem of Idealizing Inaction," featuring a former advisor who had privately described Grant's conduct as performative compliance. But the morning of the event, the moderator arrived to find the conference hall half empty and a handwritten note taped to the podium. "If your lens can't see silence as strength, it's already broken." The panel was canceled by noon. Yet none of these stories made it into the slide deck that day. They lived around the briefing, not within it. The instructor didn't cite them. He didn't need to. He simply let the image breathe a man, unmoving, beneath a flag, his spine like a question, and a weapon raised behind him by someone who believed power was something you wore. The image was so still that it looked like a sculpture, the instructor said, because he made the gun bow first. The room didn't cheer. It didn't move. It understood. At the national rollout of the program, the press waited to see if Elias Grant would appear. He did not. No one was surprised. No podium bore his name. No ribbon waited for his hand. But the weight of his absence settled over the event like a second architecture, unspoken but immovable. The auditorium where it was held had been newly renovated, yet no one looked up at the ceiling, and no one mentioned the lights. All attention was fixed on the silence between paragraphs, on the new doctrines being etched into policy not through slogans but through posture. Inside the folder handed to each attendee was a single page, printed at the back, unnumbered, no header, no signature. It read, "He did not speak, but the nation spoke instead." And while the program advanced, outside the walls of policy and reform, the tremor in culture was still unfolding. In the days leading up to the launch, a retired tactical instructor who had previously dismissed Grant's silence as optics over action recorded a video criticizing the direction policing had taken. He posted it at midnight. By morning, his license had been formally challenged by a coalition of former students who cited outdated doctrine and ethics violations. The board didn't need a long review. It voted unanimously within 72 hours to revoke his certification. The video remained online, untouched, its comments disabled not by platform moderation but by overwhelming silence. No one defended it. In Chicago, a private security firm known for employing ex-officers made headlines when it was revealed they had used Maddox's name on promotional material for high-threat executive protection services. The backlash was surgical. Within 48 hours, their contracts with 4 major corporations were terminated. A group of veterans publicly returned their honorary challenge coins awarded by the company. The CEO issued a vague apology but avoided specifics. That vagueness became the story, and within a week, the firm filed for bankruptcy. Across the country, an anonymous user leaked a list of former officers who had signed an internal petition years earlier advocating for looser weapon policies at ceremonial events. The list included several names now holding mid-level state security roles. By the end of the week, 2 had been placed on unpaid leave. 1 was quietly removed from an advisory board, and another held a press conference in an empty room that no reporter attended. He spoke for 12 minutes. The video received 13 views. In a small town in the South, a local police department that had refused to implement any of the recommended ceremonial restraint protocols found its funding redirected by county officials. The mayor protested in a televised interview, accusing the federal overreach. But a clip from that interview where the mayor stated, "We can't let decorum weaken force," was pulled and remixed across social media platforms. The soundbite became a meme, then a symbol, then a line recited ironically by teenagers in mock drills designed to parody authority. By the time the department reversed its stance, the ridicule had become irreversible. No lawsuit was filed. No one had broken the law. But the mirror had turned, and the reflection it offered refused to blink. The shift wasn't orchestrated. It wasn't dictated by orders or reinforced by threats. It spread through memory, through recognition, through a kind of collective refusal to forget. And while Elias Grant remained unseen, uncelebrated by standard metrics, the systems that had once ignored silence began to adopt its cadence. Language changed. Training materials were rewritten. Review boards cited posture as a factor in decision-making. Officers rehearsed not just reaction, but presence. And though none of it bore Grant's name, all of it was shaped by what he never said. The folders distributed that day bore no gold embossing, no ceremonial flourish, just clean print, aligned and unassuming. But they carried a new weight tone not found in ordnance, but in omission. Because what had been omitted before now stood central. Not a man, not a martyr, just a moment so powerful in its restraint that it redefined protocol. And that was how it ended, not with sound, but with structure, not with applause, but with change. Across the country, the phrase began to appear not as a slogan, but as a reminder, on the back wall of a precinct's de-escalation room, on the cover of a military field manual, whispered between cadets before ceremonial deployment, spoken by a grieving daughter at a podium when asked how her father would have wanted the nation to respond. "He wouldn't have wanted anything," she said. "He just wanted us to know what not to become." And so the story remained not of the shot that wasn't fired, nor the trial that rewrote expectation, but of a man who turned stillness into force, of a name that never needed a weapon to be remembered, of a moment where silence taught a louder lesson than law ever could. But behind the echo of that restraint, the reckoning for those who had once stood on the other side of silence unfolded without sirens or subpoenas. In a newsroom in Florida, a senior editor who had commissioned a column dismissing the funeral incident as an overcorrection in a hypersensitive climate found himself abruptly retired after leaked audio revealed him joking off-air that Grant must have had ice in his veins or nothing at all. The clip, shared first by a disgruntled intern, went viral in under 8 hours. The network apologized, not with a press conference, but by pulling 2 entire segments from syndication, erasing them like unwanted fingerprints. In a university ethics seminar, a guest lecturer who had framed the Grant Protocol as institutional cowardice disguised as dignity attempted to defend his position during a Q&A session. A student stood and calmly read the list of names of every unarmed civilian killed during ceremonial events in the last decade, ending with a simple statement: "You're not being asked to be afraid, you're being asked not to be indifferent." The recording of the exchange became a centerpiece of online discourse, and though the lecturer remained on faculty, his scheduled appearances dwindled to 0 by the following semester. At a national convention for law enforcement leadership, a former commissioner stepped up to the microphone and, in a calculated moment of provocation, asked, "At what point did standing still become the new heroism?" The room, filled with uniforms from across the country, didn't jeer. It didn't clap either. It simply stood, not in unison, not in rehearsal, but gradually, section by section, until no one remained seated except the man at the mic. He left without finishing his speech, his voice drowned not by outrage, but by its complete absence. In a high school civics classroom in Oregon, a teacher displayed a side-by-side photo comparison, one of Maddox, eyes wild in the courtroom, veins tensed with confusion, the other of Grant, standing calm beneath the weight of a flag and a firearm. One student pointed to the second image and said, "That's what we mean when we say, don't flinch." The moment, captured by a classroom visitor and shared without context, was reposted by veterans groups and educators alike. Within days, it became a template for nonverbal case studies in public service training academies. No attribution followed, and none was needed. The country didn't rewrite its history. It recalibrated its understanding of strength, and in doing so, it narrowed the stage for those who had once mistaken posture for power. There were no monuments taken down, no statues shattered, but one bronze plaque in a city square known for its ceremonial pageants was quietly removed overnight. The local government offered no replacement. The space was left bare. In its emptiness, school children stopped to ask why the platform was vacant, and their teachers answered not with dates, but with decisions. Not all stories end with fire. Some end when no one pulls the trigger, and those are the ones we are most obliged to remember.